Hi guys, and welcome back. I've been recording the process for the next few comic pages that are going up, so I thought I'd break it down for you in a sort of mini-series. Making a comic can be a pretty daunting task, so we're going to break it up into little steps for you. Today, let's start by talking about the layout. First, decide whether your reading direction will be from left to right or right to left. All comics are read in a top to bottom orientation, but within that, American comics are read left to right, and Japanese manga are read right to left. You can mix and match though. In the case of my comic, it is drawn in a manga style, but knowing that most of my readers will probably be Western, it's read in a left to right direction to make things a little bit easier on them. Keep in mind that whenever you're making a comic, it's a very creative process, so you don't have to be limited to any strict rules. Second, it's important to think about how many panels are going to be on your page. When I first started making my comic, I didn't begin by drawing. That may sound counterintuitive, but bear with me. Start by reading some of your favorite comics. While you're reading, try to examine how they divide their pages. You'll see that some are quite packed, and others may be almost a single large image on a page. But I found that the average number of panels on a page is 6 to 9, so that's typically what I use as a guideline. Third, and a unique aspect of comics, is the speech bubbles. At first, you may have a hard time placing them because they do take up a lot of space, but try not to think about them as interfering with your drawings. Instead, use your speech bubbles to guide the eye through the page, top to bottom, left to right in this case. When you're drawing the panels for your comic, you can use simple vertical and horizontal lines to create squares and rectangles, and that will work just fine for most pages where there isn't a lot of action going on. But when you have a scene where there is a lot of movement, such as a fight scene or even shouting, you can angle your panels to create diagonals. This will give the panels themselves more impact. Try not to include too many different angled panels on a page, however, as it can start to look messy. Another important feature that I like to use to break up the monotony of square and rectangular panels is a technique that's called bleeding the image. So you can have a character, or more commonly a speech bubble, that will go outside of the panel of its origin. This makes the page feel a lot less static and gives it a greater sense of motion. These are just a few of the simple techniques that I like to keep in mind when I'm first designing a page. As for the question that I get a lot, which do I design first? Do I design the characters first, or do I design the boxes first? It's actually a little bit of both. I work off of a dialogue, and so when I'm looking at that dialogue, I try to imagine the different expressions and positions that I want my characters who are talking to each other to be in. For example, if I have character 1 talking to character 2, I would like to have them sort of facing each other and probably on the same plane of the page. So I'll divide up the top half of the page into a couple of boxes where I can put those characters in. There are other parts of the story where I really want to focus on a particular pose, and so those I might draw in the pose lightly first and make it free-flowing before deciding what the constraints of the box are going to be around it. Typically, I don't think of the page as a whole when I'm designing it. I think of it as a few separate parts. It would be really hard to hold all of the dialogue and the characters in your mind before you put some of them on paper, so just start with the top of the page. You have a lot of room on the bottom, so you don't have to worry about trying to fill it up completely. What would you like the character interactions to be on the top of the page? You can simply draw those in, and then take your time to examine the space that you have and decide how much of the story you want to put on the remainder of the page. Breaking the page up into a few different parts like this can make it a little bit easier on you when you're first starting to design your page. Drawing comics can be pretty difficult sometimes, so don't get discouraged if it's not turning out the way you like it. The key is to just practice and keep trying until you feel like it looks right. As for the content of your page, you'll want to really focus on drawing anatomically correct characters. Practice your anatomy whenever you can and draw off of reference images that seem hard for you, positions that are interesting but maybe a little bit counterintuitive. That way you'll get much better at not only normal anatomy, but also concepts like foreshortening. For the dialogue, make sure that your spelling is good, and that the concepts are clearly conveyed. Another aspect that I like to use in my pages to increase the clarity is to outline a character with a thick line like a stroke, either white or a different color gray, and that's going to help bring your character forward and separate them from the background. If you find that your page is a lot of back and forth dialogue, don't be afraid to change up the point of view so you're not looking just straight at a character all the time. You can be looking at them from the left, from the right, even a little bit from the top or below them to give a more interesting perspective in a rather static situation. It's a little bit tedious positioning all of the text, but you want to make sure that it's relatively centered in your bubbles and keep it so it's large enough that you can still read it. For my text I'm using Bradley Hand for the most part, but for some instances like louder words or some of the effects I'll actually use Chalk Duster or sometimes Impact for screams. Those are two other really good texts. You can download other text online just depending on what you want to use. Comica Glaze is another really good one. I don't recommend using Comic Sans because that's just such an overused font that it doesn't really look professional. Sometimes you won't really be able to fit everything that you wanted to say into your speech bubble, so it's okay if you make it a little bit more concise or leave out some words that aren't really necessary. Even if it's not what you originally had in your dialogue, as long as it's clean and looks nice, it's going to end up being better than trying to cram everything in. Something that I like to do is when I find an artist that has an expression that I like, or maybe a certain type of scene layout that I like, I try to keep it in mind and use it as soon as I can within the next page and see if I like it in part of my style. And if I do, then I try to incorporate it into my regular drawings. So let's recap a little bit. First, decide on your reading direction. Second, decide on the number of panels that are going to be in your page. Third, use your speech bubbles to direct the flow of attention. And fourth, you can vary the size and angulation of your panels to make it more visually interesting. I wanted to touch briefly on what part of the process I'm doing here. I'm actually moving my completed drawing from Procreate on my iPad back onto my laptop so I can use Photoshop. I found a really great set of speech bubbles from Zombie Smile. She's an artist on DeviantArt who also does her own professional manga in Germany, and her stuff is really cool, so I encourage you to check her out too. I downloaded these speech bubbles from her DeviantArt, and while I was drawing speech bubbles by hand before, I really am enjoying the speech bubbles that she provided, so I'm incorporating them into my own comic. To do this, I just open them in one image in Photoshop, and then I use the lasso tool to select, copy, and paste whichever speech bubble fits best into the space on my comic. It's really easy, and I encourage you to look for your own speech bubbles, patterns, textures, brushes that are going to make your life easier for your comic. I can't really suggest many specific ones because it really depends on the feel that you like for your comic, but there's lots of great ones online or even on DeviantArt, so if you spend some time looking through some of the textures and patterns that you like, then I'm sure that'll give you some more inspiration for your comic, and it'll also give it a more polished effect. I take my drawing all the way through the shading on Procreate, but I still wait until I'm back in Photoshop to add the textures. I've built up a pretty big texture library in Photoshop, and I've been using it for a lot of years, so that's just the method that I'm more comfortable with. There are plenty of great resources out there for you, and I'd like to be one of them too. So if you have any comicking questions or any questions about drawing at all, don't hesitate to leave me a message in the comments below. I'd love to read it. Thank you for watching. Bye guys. See you in the next video.